There was this powerful samurai philosophy in the 16th century of Japan, where the greatest swordsman once told his students that mastery begins the moment you learn to lose on purpose. The monastery in Kyoto, where, once a year, the most skilled swordsmen in Japan gather not to compete, but to lose. They bow before their masters, step into the center of the dojo, and deliberately perform their kata incorrectly. They fumble their strikes, stumble in their footwork, and allow themselves to be disarmed by students half their skill level. When the ritual ends, these masters sit in silence while younger practitioners openly criticize their failures. This is not hazing. This is not punishment. This is shippai no keiko, the deliberate practice of failure, and it was once considered the most advanced training a samurai could undergo. We spend our entire lives building armor around our ego. We curate our victories, hide our mistakes, and construct elaborate narratives about our competence. But the samurai understood something we've forgotten. The ego is not your ally. It's a liability that will get you killed when reality refuses to cooperate with your self-image. So they developed a technology for dismantling it, a systematic method of engineering their own humiliation until shame lost its power over them. This wasn't positive thinking. This wasn't resilience training. This was controlled ego death, and it turned ordinary warriors into something else entirely. In 1612, a young samurai named Usaka arrived at a training compound in the mountains outside Osaka. He had spent 6 years mastering kenjutsu under a respected teacher, and his technique was flawless. His cuts were clean, his movements economical, his form textbook perfect. He came to this compound expecting to refine his skills, perhaps learn some advanced techniques from the legendary instructor who ran the facility. Instead, on his first morning, the instructor handed him a wooden sword and told him to lose a duel against a farmer who had been training for 3 months. Usaka assumed this was a test of his teaching ability, so he engaged the farmer cautiously, offering openings and gentle corrections. The instructor stopped the match immediately. "You misunderstand," he said. "I want you to actually lose, fight with all your skill, and still be defeated." Usaka was confused, but he was obedient. He fought again, this time pulling his strikes at the last moment, allowing the farmer's clumsy overhead swing to tap his head. The instructor stopped the match again. "You're still in control," he said. "You chose when to lose. I want you to be genuinely defeated by someone beneath your skill level." For 3 weeks, Usaka faced this impossible task. He fought opponents he should have easily beaten, and he was required to lose without deliberately throwing the match. The instruction was paradoxical and maddening. If he fought seriously, he won. If he held back, he was choosing the loss. The instructor rejected both. What the old master was actually demanding was something far more sophisticated. Usaka had to fight at full capacity, while simultaneously releasing his attachment to the outcome so completely that genuine defeat became possible. He had to stop protecting his identity as a skilled swordsman. He had to stop flinching away from the feeling of inadequacy. He had to enter a psychological state where losing carried no emotional charge whatsoever. The breakthrough came during a match against a merchant's son who telegraphed every move and left his guard open constantly. Usaka saw the openings, felt his muscle memory reaching for the winning strikes, and then something shifted. He stopped trying to lose. He stopped trying to win. He simply moved, and in that moment of complete non-attachment, the merchant's son landed a strike across his ribs that drove the air from his lungs. Usaka had been genuinely defeated by an inferior opponent, and he felt something crack open inside his chest. It wasn't shame, it was space. The samurai didn't stumble into failure training by accident. They engineered it with the same precision they brought to every martial discipline. In traditional dojos across feudal Japan, masters developed elaborate systems for systematically destroying their students' self-concepts. These weren't random humiliations or crude hazing rituals. They were carefully calibrated psychological interventions designed to target specific attachments and identities. One common practice was called the month of incompetence. A skilled practitioner would be required to perform all techniques with their non-dominant hand for 30 consecutive days. They would eat, write, draw their sword, and fight exclusively with the hand they'd never trained. Every movement became awkward. Every task took 3 times longer. Students who had achieved effortless flow in their practice suddenly couldn't complete basic actions without looking clumsy and incompetent. The point wasn't to develop ambidexterity, though that sometimes happened. The point was to force the student to inhabit the feeling of being a beginner again, to sit with the discomfort of visible struggle, to divorce their identity from their competence. Another technique involved public confession rituals. Once per season, senior students would gather the entire dojo and systematically recount their failures, mistakes, and moments of cowardice from the previous months. These weren't vague admissions. They were specific, detailed accounts delivered with the same precision used to describe successful techniques. On the 15th day of the 8th month, I allowed my fear of Tanaka's counterattack to make me hesitate during kumite. I saw the opening for oshitaoshi and chose safety over commitment. My technique was cowardly. The other students wouldn't offer comfort or reassurance. They would simply bow in acknowledgement. The ritual transformed shame from a thing to be hidden into a thing to be examined, named, and released. Perhaps the most sophisticated practice was what some schools called the mirror duel. 2 students of equal skill would face each other, but only one would be allowed to attack while the other could only defend and evade. They would maintain this dynamic for the entire match, and then they would switch roles. The twist was that the matches were designed to be unwinnable for the defender. The attacker would eventually land a strike. Always. The goal wasn't to test defensive skill. It was to give students hundreds of repetitions of the experience of inevitable defeat. Over time, something remarkable happened. Students stopped experiencing the moment of being struck as failure. It became just another moment. No different from blocking or evading. The emotional charge dissolved through sheer repetition. In the modern West, we've absorbed the idea that failure is valuable for learning. Growth mindset, ideology, tells us to embrace our mistakes, to see them as stepping stones, to extract lessons from our setbacks. This sounds similar to shippai no keiko, but it's fundamentally different in a way most people miss. Western failure philosophy is still ego-protective. It reframes failure as secret success. I didn't really fail, the logic goes. I just gathered data for my future victory. The ego remains intact, simply telling itself a different story. Shippai no keiko doesn't reframe anything. It doesn't extract silver linings or find hidden lessons. It forces you to sit in the raw experience of failure, to feel the blow to your self-concept, to experience the humiliation or disappointment or shame, fully and completely, and then to notice that you're still here. You didn't die. Your awareness didn't collapse. The self you were protecting was revealed to be optional, a story you were telling, not a fact you were defending. This is closer to what Buddhist practitioners call ego death than anything in contemporary Western psychology. Usaka discovered this difference during his 4th month at the compound. The instructor began a new practice. Every evening, students would gather, and the instructor would select one person to stand in the center of the circle. That person would then be subjected to detailed public criticism of their technique, character, and progress. There was no balance, no compliment sandwich, no constructive framing, just pure, unflinching assessment of inadequacy. When Usaka's turn came, the instructor spent 20 minutes describing all the ways Usaka's swordsmanship was mediocre, how his footwork lacked fluidity, how his commitment to strikes was inconsistent, how his breathing revealed his anxiety, how his need for approval made him hesitant. Usaka's first instinct was to defend himself mentally, to argue back in his head, to compile evidence of his competence. Then he remembered the farmer he'd lost 2 months ago, and the feeling of space that had opened when he stopped protecting his identity. So he tried something different. Muntu, he listened to each criticism, and instead of resisting it, He looked for the sensation it created in his body, the tightness in his chest, the heat in his face, the urge to explain or justify. He didn't try to make these sensations go away. He just watched them arise and pass. And underneath all that reactivity, he found something stable, a part of him that existed independent of being good at swordsmanship, independent of the instructor's approval, independent of his own self-story. The human nervous system is remarkably adaptable. Expose it to the same stimulus repeatedly, and it habituates. This is true for physical sensations, and it's equally true for emotional ones. The samurai understood this long before neuroscience gave us the vocabulary to describe it. They knew that shame, humiliation, and ego threat were just patterns of activation in the body, and like any pattern, they could be desensitized through systematic exposure. Modern exposure therapy for phobias operates on this same principle. If you're afraid of spiders, you start by looking at pictures of spiders until your nervous system stops reacting. Then videos. Then spiders behind glass. Then spiders in the room. Eventually, you can hold a spider without panic because your system has learned the spider isn't actually dangerous. Shippai no keiko applies this logic to ego threats. If you're attached to your reputation as competent, you start by making small mistakes in front of people you don't know well, then larger mistakes, then mistakes in front of people whose opinions you value. Eventually, you can experience complete public failure, and your nervous system doesn't interpret it as a threat to your survival. But the samurai added a crucial element that modern exposure therapy often misses. They practiced failure at the edge of their competence, not in areas where they were already comfortable with inadequacy. It's easy to shrug off failure at something you're not invested in. The real test is failing at the thing you've built your identity around. A master swordsman deliberately losing duels, a respected teacher publicly admitting ignorance, a senior practitioner performing kata so poorly that beginners laugh. This is where the ego has real stakes, and therefore where the training has real power. Yusaka's training intensified in his 7th month. He was instructed to teach a class of beginners while deliberately demonstrating techniques incorrectly. Not subtly wrong, but obviously, embarrassingly wrong. He had to stand in front of students who trusted his expertise and show them sword grips that would get them killed, footwork that would make them fall, strikes that left them completely exposed. And he had to do this while the instructor and senior students watched from the side of the dojo. Every instinct in his body screamed against it. His identity as a competent martial artist was being attacked not by someone else, but by his own hands. The first few classes were agony. He could feel his face burning, his throat tight, his mind generating a continuous stream of justifications and excuses. But he wasn't allowed to explain that the demonstration was intentionally wrong. He just had to do it and sit with the students' confusion and disappointment. By the 3rd week, something shifted. The burning in his face was still there, but he'd stopped identifying with it. It was just a sensation, like the ache in his legs after a long training session. The student's judgment was still there, but it was just information, like the sound of rain on the roof. His identity as a good teacher was still being threatened, but he'd stopped needing to defend it. After 14 months at the compound, Yusaka was given his final test. He would face the instructor in a public match, attended by students, visiting masters, and local dignitaries. The instruction was simple: lose in the first exchange, not through throwing the match, but through genuine defeat. Everything he'd learned about releasing attachment, about sitting with ego death, about divorcing his sense of self from his performance, would be tested in the highest stakes environment he'd ever encountered. The match began at dawn. Yusaka bowed, drew his wooden sword, and entered a state of complete presence. He wasn't trying to lose. He wasn't trying to protect himself from the shame of losing. He wasn't trying to win while pretending not to care. He simply engaged with the instructor's movement, responded to openings as they appeared, and maintained absolute awareness of the arising and passing of thoughts, sensations, and impulses. The instructor attacked high. Yusaka moved to block. The instructor redirected mid-strike. A feint. Yusaka recognized from hundreds of training sessions. Every instinct told him to counter to the instructor's now exposed left side. He saw the winning move clearly, and he released it. Not through forcing himself to miss, but through genuine non-attachment to the outcome. He executed the counter with full commitment and precision, but somewhere in the space between intention and action, his investment in landing the strike dissolved. The instructor's redirection completed. His sword caught Yusaka across the collarbone, and the match was over in seconds. Yusaka had been utterly defeated, and he felt nothing but clarity. What he'd discovered through 14 months of systematic ego destruction was something the samurai had known for centuries. The self you spend your entire life defending doesn't actually exist the way you think it does. It's a story, a convenient fiction, a narrative construct that your mind maintains to create the feeling of continuity and control. When that story is threatened, your nervous system reacts as if you're being physically attacked. But if you can learn to sit with that reaction, to feel it fully without being consumed by it, you discover something underneath, a kind of awareness that exists independent of the story, that continues regardless of whether you're winning or losing, respected or humiliated, competent or incompetent. You're not a samurai. You don't live in feudal Japan. You're not training for literal combat, where ego attachment could get you killed. But you're still controlled by the same psychological mechanisms those warriors learned to dismantle. You still build your identity around your competence in certain domains. You still protect your reputation, avoid situations where you might look foolish, curate your image, and experience genuine distress when your self-concept is threatened. And all of that takes enormous energy that could be directed elsewhere. The practice of planned failure isn't about becoming comfortable with mediocrity or lowering your standards. It's about separating your sense of self from your performance so that you can engage with challenges without the enormous overhead of ego protection. When you're not constantly defending an identity, you can see situations more clearly, respond more flexibly, and recover from setbacks instantly, because setbacks stop registering as threats to your existence. This is what the samurai meant by mushin, or no mind. Not the absence of thought, but the absence of self-referential thought, the constant internal commentary about what everything means about you. You can begin this practice in small, controlled ways. Choose something you're competent at, something you've built part of your identity around, and deliberately perform it poorly in a low-stakes environment. If you're a good writer, post something with obvious grammatical errors. If you're known for being on time, show up 15 minutes late to something unimportant and don't explain why. If you're the person who always has insightful things to say in meetings, spend one entire meeting saying nothing. Notice the discomfort that arises. Don't try to fix it, reframe it, or make it go away. Just observe it, the way you'd observe a muscle ache after exercise. As you build tolerance for small ego deaths, gradually increase the stakes. Make mistakes in front of people whose opinions you value. Admit ignorance about something you're supposed to know. Take on a challenge where you're genuinely likely to fail, and let other people watch you struggle. The goal isn't to seek out failure indiscriminately. It's to systematically desensitize yourself to the feeling of your self-concept being threatened, so that fear of ego death stops limiting what you're willing to attempt. The samurai did this because their lives depended on being able to act decisively regardless of how the action might make them look. Your life probably doesn't depend on it, but your freedom might. The compound where Yusaka trained no longer exists. The specific practices of shippai no keiko have largely been lost or exist only in fragmented forms in certain traditional schools. But the psychological technology they developed remains valid because the human nervous system hasn't changed. You still experience ego threat as a type of danger. You still organize your behavior around avoiding that danger. And you still have the capacity to systematically desensitize yourself to it through deliberate exposure. The question is whether you're willing to do what those warriors did. Engineer your own defeats. Sit with the discomfort of ego dissolution and discover what remains when the story you've been telling about yourself finally falls away. What they found on the other side wasn't invincibility or fearlessness. It was something quieter and more useful, the ability to engage fully with reality without the constant interference of self-protection. To act without the need for every action to confirm your identity. To lose without losing yourself. To fail without failing at being human. This is what shippai no keiko was actually training. Not resilience or grit or perseverance, but the capacity to exist independent of outcomes. And that capacity, once developed, changes everything about how you move through the world.